In any maturation process of reaching an adult and individual assessment, there's a stage of sympathy, opening up, being innocent, being receptive to everything that comes in. There's an adolescent stage, so that's the sympathy is the state of the child. There's an adolescent state of rebelling and rejecting all the things that create some form of unnecessary suffering or don't fit. And then finally, there's a state of synthesis where you can take the rejection of everything, the sympathy and openness to everything, and start piecing together bits and pieces that, at least for now, make more sense than not, are more valuable than nothing, are true enough, or take one in the direction of beauty, truth, goodness, and symmetry at that particular time. So this is a free form of where I've arrived at that synthesis in relation to concept synergy and Lazaris and the Lazaris material. So in the sympathy pile of kind of openness and appreciation, Lazaris has created an extraordinary body of ideas, of processes, of systems of thinking, of articulating things, which stimulate thought, which often have a great vibe to them, which are unique, which are relatively integrated. You know, so there's a fair amount of integrity within the material. And Concept Synergy has produced and published and sold that material in a variety of formats. On the negative or the rejection pile is, I think it's limiting and arrogant for Lazaris to state that they are the highest resonance that ever will contact the planet, to elevate themselves to a place of being more than any human being is capable of assessing, for one. And secondly, it kind of limits the future, because while Lazaris's techniques work some of the time for some people in certain areas, none of them work all of the time for all people in all areas. And for that to be placed, you know, as the be-all and end-all for humanity is something I thoroughly reject, because it closes the door. And, you know, there's also the synthesis of, you know, Lazaris stating that their techniques work, and the Lazaris community and Concept Synergy constantly hyping, do this, did you do this tape, try this tape, etc. And the rejection of, you know, just noticing so many other things that work better in so many ways. They're more fun, they're more successful, they have a better statistical track record, you know, than Lazaris techniques. I think that where I land on using the material as some kind of a guide or a network of ideas to navigate one's life, I would say that 30% of the time, the ideas can move me and move others in a positive direction. You know, when we understand that life is a journey that doesn't end, it's not about getting there, it's about, does it help you take the next step? I believe it was Lazaris, that first populated my mind with the idea that clearly written goals were something that most successful people did and were a good idea, and bingo, my productivity went up 400%, creating my own recipe of working with that. What I reject is the tunnel vision that I see in so much of the community around working exclusively with Lazaris, particularly when the results are poor. Whether it's my commodity investing friend doing the same old Lazaris techniques for years and losing money for years, trading commodities, or other people working on failing relationships for years trying to use the Lazaris techniques. I think it's highly destructive to get locked into a self-shaming protocol of failure, which is very easy to do because the material is so vast. On the money tape, where Lazaris at one point said, as long as it's within your principles, in other words, you have to have principles, and once you have them, then you have character by abiding by them, which I think is, makes sense. But then Lazaris made a comment. He said, so if it's in your principles to rob a bank, then rob a bank, as long as it's within your principles. And that's where I think, it gets a little untethered from objective impact, because it's all very well to say that all values are completely relative, just pick some value and live by it. But different values create different statistical impacts. And a world where everyone goes around stealing people's money first of all, destroys trust. Well, Lazaris has said trust is a very important element. It is. It is a foundation for partnering and effective synergy and love. So to have a principle that destroys trust and with it love and synergy and partnering is a tremendously more painful and destructive world than a world founded on a principle of honoring commitment. When you get into some of these higher principles of commitment, then you have to get more and more nuanced, because it's commitment to what? And whatever you commit to, you can get so obsessional about it that it can damage other things without a sense of proportion. And so there's an art to all of this that one certainly can't learn from listening to thousands of hours of tapes. And I think I also, reject that particular path of just going deeper and deeper into the material, where I would say, statistically speaking, I don't see huge increases in success with people involved with concept synergy in their romantic relationships or in their money, etc., that they didn't have before. Plenty of wealthy people get involved with Lazaris, and they had wealth before or had those skills before. I don't see, generally people, coming in penniless and buying a lot of crystals at 10 times the price and then suddenly having millions. That's mostly reserved for Jach Pursel. His staff have remained poor because he pays them low wages. And so that would be, in the rejection category, or, antipathy. I don't at all like the way Jack and Penny created or ran the company, or use fear and a variety of bullying techniques, referencing the material to kind of justify their bullying, like we're not going to stand for this, or that's a negative ego, etc. In other words, they're borrowing from the material as a means of justifying control, fear, domination, bullying, arbitrary behavior, and shaming. As in remembering a time when there was a German guy making a comment about something, and Penny basically blamed him in the forum for Nazi Germany. Like the Germans, you did this, and this is outlandish, and I reject the idea that anyone close to Lazaris is further along the path that Lazaris outlines. Meaning all you have to do is look at the intimate bios of the staff who do some of the most readings with Lazaris and are always around, in those workshops, and looking at their lives, they're not statistically better lives. In fact, if they worked for Google, they'd be paid a lot more and, might have better senses of boundaries and have other cultural problems. Penny and Michael's, relatively tragic and, seemingly horrific death, and that dynamic in Jach's bullying and betraying of his staff members. I'm not sure, or certainly the shaming of not showing care and putting more focus on his own desire for secrecy than their need to integrate traumatic experiences. I reject that entirely as being unnecessary, uninformed, and dysfunctional. And it takes in abusive and unhealthy relationships, it takes someone being willing to take that and not being able to create better alternatives and not being able to or willing to create better alternatives for themselves. And it takes someone willing to do that. So someone has to be willing to take a pay cut to work for the Lazaris material, which is all about abundance and fun and success. And, in that crazy making dynamic, someone has to be willing to take that end of the contract. But someone also, like Jach, has to be willing to offer it. Here, sign here, take a pay cut, lose benefits, don't get retirement, and you can be part of a synergistic company that treats you relatively badly, punishes you and shames you for mistake. I also, deeply reject the sense that that's a spiritual family. And in those rejections, reject the mindset that comes up with these delusions and dysfunctions. And that mindset is influenced by Lazaris. What I do accept and what I do value is the awareness that every system, particularly idealistic systems, is innately flawed and has a shadow side, a destructive side, a painful side. And that's true with the Lazaris material, that's true with the Lazaris relationship. Having a paid friend, who pays their friends to be friends in a monologue without dialogue relationship in which one friend does 99% of the talking? It's a dysfunctional model. And the staff model is dysfunctional. So there's so many levels of dysfunction in any system. There's dysfunction in my own family, in every family. There's dysfunction in my own romantic relationships and every relationship that I've seen in areas. So I think the question is it a step forward? Lazaris uses the reference point ultimately that every human being has a focus in life of consciously creating success and consciously creating fun. Well, it's not fun or successful to take a pay cut, to be abused and work for concept synergy. So where do you, well, for most people, most of the time. But if you're unemployed and in abusive relationships, going to being employed in an abusive relationship is a step forward. And if you can iterate and learn to, and you have any support within that framework to make the relationship better, then it becomes a better relationship. And if it's more fun and more successful to leave that relationship, I remember, making that point when I learned so much more from human beings than I ever did from Lazaris about successful romantic relationships. And it was just eye-opening to see how easy it was, how fun it was to, learn to make requests or, hey, you didn't give me, I didn't give you permission for this, or let's find a win-win here, and things like that are really useful in changing a dynamic that need practice. They need embodiment, and so that's another rejection. I reject the disembodiment of going to seminar after seminar about Atlantis and Lemuria and disembodied topics and sitting there in a lecture format without talking and engaging with other people, without somatizing the experience. And again, have learned so much more from physically doing things and talking things through as opposed to just listening to monologues, however magnificent. And I accept the magnificence of Lazaris's monologues. I wouldn't care if Jach had made them all up at some point, other than elevating himself to be the greatest being in contact with humans. Hey, if Jach's got that degree of memory and organization and note-taking and brainstorming, and Lazaris does tend to draw, I don't know if it's all or 80%, but it's the vast majority of the Lazaris material can be found in the foundation of good thinking humans. Lazaris references beauty, truth, and goodness, Platonic values. Lazaris references the Enneagram. He didn't invent it. Astrology, he didn't invent that either. The Arthurian legends, he didn't invent that. Belief work, meditation, healing the inner child, healing the inner adolescent, doing shame work. Lazaris invented none of it. What Lazaris does, and this may be a principle of theirs, to not introduce new ideas, but simply to more poetically and beautifully combine the best that human beings are already writing about and thinking. And in that way, if you use a Star Trek analogy, Star Trek's first rule is don't mess with the evolution of other species. Observe, but don't manipulate it. And so such a principle would dictate amplifying. He's talked about Abraham Maslow's and hierarchy of needs and excellence, or the Kabbalah. All of these things are magnificent parts of human beings, which, as I broke out of the self-referential loop within the community and began reading and studying the best that humans have put together of well-being, technology, growth, ideas. It's often fun to see the correlation and juxtaposition of how they present something and how Lazaris presented something similar based on that. And that's, I think, where I land in kind of synthesis, that depth perception. Why do we have two eyes? Why do we have two ears? Well, this eye sees things just from a slightly different angle. It sees the same thing, but from a different angle. It's a perspective. This one sees the same thing, again, different angle. You combine those two different but similar perspectives and you get a synthesis. The synthesis is depth perception. A new dimension emerges. And so I think that the place that I land with is that in so many areas of psychology, of the inner experience, thoughts, feelings, sensations, Lazaris and or Jach Pursel have produced a body of work that is from a unique perspective. There's a unique vibe, there's a unique style, there is a unique spin on the idea. And, as I say, because the more I read, the more I find that, whether it was Andrew North Whitehead or Seth or other sources in history or in recent past that Lazaris has woven into their material, it's from a different angle, and I enjoy hearing what John Bradshaw has to say about shame, what Brené Brown has to say about shame, what Robert Bly has to say about shame, and then listening to what Lazaris has to say about shame, and then correlating that with the newer science that Lazaris has not gotten into, unfortunately, which is about trauma and PTSD and how that correlates with shame, which I think is a bit of an oversight or a blind spot. Former staff members are severely traumatized by their treatment by Jach Pursel and concept synergy. And Lazaris does not seem to have brought a sensitivity into that company or group of relationships to minimize that, to reintegrate and heal that, to take responsibility, the ability and willingness to respond, which means you need a paradigm, you need language. That's severely missing. And in that missing, it's a big problem. I reject the idea that this material is suitable for everyone. I reject the idea that this material is suitable for anyone in certain stages, in certain times. My therapists are severely critical of Lazaris for emphasizing to a traumatized, suicidal young boy, which I was in my teens, while listening to the material about how I created my reality, that this is not shaming and abusive, because children always blame themselves and shame themselves for the faults of their culture and parents to begin with, and to pile on "you're creating it all and they don't really exist" is highly problematic. At the very least, it has a dark side, and does the positive side outweigh that? I think it depends. So I think that, my synthesis is that if Lazaris is no more than a third of, a guidance system, your own life experience, I think, should be the majority guidance system of, what is and has worked, etc. And then there's kind of the aspirational guidance system of this is what works in the world that I'm in, but this is the world I'd like to be in, and this is what I would like to work in the world I would like to be in. I think that in that domain, having Lazaris be, a strong pole of a perspective. This is what that looks like from this perspective. And then to mix that and vary it. There's times I'm absolutely sick of the endless thing, stuff that Lazaris, it just feels, like, an endless stream that becomes an allergic reaction. And then hearing something similar from a completely different voice, from a different style, I'm much more open to it, at that time. So again, as in a diet, you eat potatoes all day. They could, carrots, one of my favorite vegetables. You just eat them morning, noon and night. You get sick of carrots. And I think it's really useful to be very clear that when you're sick of Lazaris or any other source, or sick from a concentration of too much of the same stuff without more diversity. And this actually ties in a little bit with, what Lazaris has talked about, breaking and building systems. Well, that includes the Lazaris system. And all truths are true, so pick the ones that work. That includes the Lazaris system. And so there are valid perspectives for seeing just about anything from one point or another. I think the most constructive thing to reference is, ironically, conscious success, conscious fun, growth and effort towards that, and regularly sampling. There's also hedonic adaptation, which says that if you do anything too much, you become numb to it. It stops having impact. I find that, if I keep doing too many Lazaris meditations, my mind starts wandering because it's like I heard those words last week or whatever, but listening to a new voice, suddenly it's all fresh. It's not that it's better or worse necessarily than Lazaris. It's just a different flavor, but it's registering in a way that's engaging. And I do the same with pizza. It's sickening to eat too many meals in a row. I haven't had pizza for a while. Wow, aren't those flavors amazing from my favorite place with my favorite buffalo mozzarella and pepperoncinis and fresh basil? To be fresh, you need variety. So in summary, everything in moderation. I think that the world is a richer, more flavorful place because the Lazaris material exists. I'm sure it's been beneficial as well as limiting for a large number of people at different times, depending on how they use it. And ultimately, it's up to us to find our own relationship with something in correlation to our values. And I find that if I can dose it right, there remains a constructive place for the Lazaris material, and with that, a constructive role for a company to disseminate those materials in convenient ways.